anybody there?
Hey, Jaime. I'm so sorry for that.
Oh, no
Yeah,
worries.
I don't know why I'm apologizing for it. It's just that I couldn't get into the meeting at
Oh no,
first, and then
you're fine.
all right.
That was all me. I am usually working on some kind of technical difficulty, but I am so happy to get to talk to you, and also very grateful for your time because I know that it's quite late over there.
Oh, no worries, no worries. I'm very grateful to be on your show, and yeah, thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, not a problem. So, do you mind if we get started and if we begin at the beginning of your creative journey? Can you tell me a little bit about what your upbringing was like and how creativity came to be a part of that, just to set the stage on where you come from?
Sure. So, both my parents in the Philippines are writers. My father recently passed away, so
Oh, I'm
but I'll
sorry.
still yeah, that's fine. But anyway, it was my father who was very active in the literary scene in the Philippines. He was a poet and essayist and occasionally a fiction writer. So we had a lot of books at home. And so it wasn't something that any or either of my parents told me to do, or I wasn't pressured into writing. It's just that because we were such a literary family, there were a lot of books at home, and then I saw my dad writing at his favorite armchair, and sometimes he'd read his poetry to me. It's it was something that I gravitated towards naturally.
Mhm.
And so I was born in the Philippines, and we came to the US when I was 3 years old. My mom was doing her PhD on a Fulbright grant at the
Mhm.
University of Delaware, and my dad brought me to the public library all the time. So he would go to the adult section and read Borges, and then I would go to the kids section and read the Bernstein Bears. And and later on I'd move on to the Narnia Chronicles and to A Wrinkle in Time. So I started out as a reader, and eventually I started writing. I first started writing fiction, if I remember correctly, and then I won some poetry competitions at my elementary school in Delaware,
Mm.
and I think a few essay competitions too. I'm not sure anymore, but anyway, and so because of that, I my dad was really proud of me, and then he was like, "You're a poet now." So in that sense, there was some pressure, but it wasn't really pressure. It was more like encouragement that this is something that I could do, and this is something that people actually did. It's hard to be a creative person when you don't know that other people do this thing that they
Mhm.
call poetry or whatever. So anyway, I started out as a poet, and then in college I was an English major at the University of the Philippines. So after my mom finished her PhD, we went back to the Philippines. And so I'm flipping back
Oh
to
no,
my
that's fine.
childhood.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. But anyway, I had so much culture shock because these were my people. And when I was growing up in the States, I felt in many ways alienated. I
Mhm.
wasn't really that conscious of being a person of color, but then I'd experience some I'd have some experiences of discrimination here and there, but I never truly felt like I belonged.
Mhm.
And then Delaware is such a white
Yeah.
state. So
Yeah.
anyway, I grew up in New York, very close to Wilmington, where yeah, Joe Biden is based.
Mm.
But so so anyway, and then most of my friends were people of color too, so Mexicans and Chinese.
Mhm.
Yeah, most of my friends were Mexican or Chinese or Asian American. But anyway, when we went back, I thought that I would belong. And then turns out stood out like a sore thumb because I yeah, I couldn't
Yeah,
understand
what
or speak Tagalog anymore. So I
okay,
had to relearn the language.
so just to clarify the timeline here, how much time did you folks spend in the US? Cuz it must have been enough that you felt like you were forgetting your first language, right?
It was 5 years.
Yeah,
And
okay.
we arrived there when I was 3 years old, and then we left when I was about to turn 9.
Oh man,
So
those are huge years. Yeah.
yeah, and those are formative years. So I could like remember some bits of Tagalog, but like these words would hover on my tongue, but like couldn't quite leap away from my
Yeah.
mouth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I came back to the language when I was in the Philippines, I felt like I was returning to something familiar yet foreign to me,
Right.
if that makes any sense.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And yeah, and I think that relearning the language informed my own creative process. So I write primarily in English, but I feel somehow that my Filipino-ness and like knowing Tagalog also in weird ways informs my use of the English language, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
You feel like perhaps intuitively you are still thinking in your native language, not necessarily,
Yeah.
in the way that you're formulating thought, but just in the soulfulness
Yes.
of something.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, I can totally empathize with that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, like probably is yeah, since even in the US like a lot of writers of color like have that experience of traversing different languages and different cultures and
Mhm.
inhabiting very different spaces, oftentimes simultaneously.
Mhm.
And I still feel that way. And at the same time, the Philippines is a former US colony, and we had to learn English in school, but we use English the way Filipinos do. So if there's such a thing as like Indian English or Singaporean English, there's also Filipino English. And we were oftentimes told that like there's certain expressions in Filipino English that are ungrammatical, like they're wrong. And
Mm.
I grew up in the Philippines believing that Filipino English was bad English. And it was only when I returned to the States to do my MFA that I realized that even when I was using English the right way, I was still using English the way a Filipino would. So it wasn't necessarily wrong to use English the way I would because I'm a Filipino to begin with. And there are just so many Englishes
Mhm.
that exist in the world, even within what we call American English. There, there's so many like writers of immigrant background these
Mhm.
days within who like work like who write in America and like publish in America and like
Yeah.
bring their own backgrounds
It's
into like the language.
full variance all over the place. I
Yes.
and so just backtracking just a moment here, to get to the point when you decided to come over to continue furthering your education for your writing specifically. You went to Texas, right? Like, is that kind of where?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm very curious of culture shock, in particular that time that you spent in the East Coast and in Texas later on in life.
Yeah.
That is an area that is so powerful to me. It's something that I experienced when I was very young myself. And to get to hear your perspective on that would be very, very exciting to me, especially when you entered an academic setting and what that was like in America as a writer who, at that point, I mean, you're pretty well formed in a lot of ways, your
Yes.
perspective and kind of how you want to put things down on paper, but I'm curious what kind of culture clash there was in those classrooms, in those forums to learn.
Hmm.
If you could elaborate a little bit.
Well, maybe we could go back to the moment I landed in Austin. It was like I believed that when I returned to America, it wouldn't be that difficult. Of course, I was like scared shitless because because like I was going to the US to live alone as an adult and attend graduate school, and it was something that I wanted to do, but once it was real, I wasn't sure if I'd survive it. And I believed at first that so I was like trying to like steel myself. I was like, okay, you lived in the States for 5 years as a kid. It won't be that foreign to you. And besides, you felt like a foreigner in the Philippines anyway. People thought you were American because of the way you spoke. So it'll be fine. And then we landed in Austin and it was so dry and dusty and nothing like the East Coast, which was so green and lush. And then it was like 105 degrees
Oh,
when we got there. And then it was so hot. It was so different from the America I knew. And so there was that. And then there was a Filipino couple who picked me up and took me in for my first few weeks. And they were like, "Oh, you're like the new immigrant, and then we can like, well, we're gonna take care of you, but at the same time, like you're still fresh off the boat." And then I'm like, "No,
mm.
I'm not. I grew up here." And then like they felt I was uppity, and yeah. So
Oh
why am I
goodness.
talking about this? But anyway, back in 2010, the Michener Center even then was trying to take in a more diverse cohort.
Hmm.
So there was me and there was in my cohort there was one other person who was a person of color, and she was a black writer from Louisiana,
Mm.
and we were practically the two brown faces in the
Wow.
classroom. So it
Yeah,
was
yeah.
daunting. And then most of my classmates were from the Midwest. They were white, and it could be a struggle. Like there were microaggressions,
Mm.
and it was tough, especially during the first year because like I was Miss Fresh off the boat and like they didn't know what to make of me. Like these were people who oftentimes encountered Filipino people on TV, and the way we're represented on TV is like
Yeah.
so like I'd be asked if I was like part of a Filipino gang.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
stupid things
Yeah.
like that. Like eventually the guy who asked me that became a friend. But so it's water under the bridge, but still things were very different from the way they are now, I believe.
Yeah, and I do agree with you because when we're talking about 2010, I mean, that's 12 years ago, and
Yeah.
you've seen a lot of cultural change here. And that was just about when I was leaving school. And so I remember a litany of microaggressions and all kinds of things like that. So for you to be in that space, which was, I mean, it's one of the premier writing places in this
Yes.
country over at the Michener Center. And to delve a little bit deeper on it, just in terms of what you learned there, because clearly there were some barriers that made it difficult to be in that space sometimes. You said maybe it got a little bit better as it went on, as you started making more friendships.
Yeah, and like also I regret that I didn't deepen my friendship with my black classmate. Like I think that we recognized early on that things would be harder for us than for our white classmates, but it was 2010, so we
Yeah,
were
yeah.
like we're not sure if we should talk about this because if we talk about this, then are we going to be whiny and
And
shouldn't we
difficult
be
to work with,
grateful?
or yeah.
Yeah, yes, and like, are we gonna like start forming a gang as like one of my classmates suggested? And apart from that, like as a person of color, you're made to feel that you should be grateful, and
Hmm.
it's not really something that like the white administrators of this program force you to think, but it's cultural too. Your parents or like your community will make you feel that like, oh, you got into such a prestigious space that we're not even supposed to eh, we're not even supposed to be in, and
Hmm.
then you have to be grateful. Like it's very ingrained in society.
Right. That you must accept the good with the bad because you're so lucky to be in that position for sure. So, do you recall though if there were some things creatively that challenged you in a good way, or things that you were able to take away from is it 2 years or 3 years over there?
3 years.
3 years, right. So, because I know that also that one of the things about Michener is that you have various capacities, right? Or people working in different forms, like you have poets, you have
Yeah.
fiction. So, for you and to have that experience, I'm sure that there must have been something good happening there in terms of
Oh yeah,
creative progress. So,
definitely.
what were some takeaways? I know it's a lot to try to summarize, but
Yeah.
if there are some things that you appreciated about that.
So I'm not sure if I had a work ethic when I came into the Michener Center, but since we had deadlines, I started developing a work ethic. And once you start writing regularly, you just improve as a writer.
Mm,
So I turned in the only good story I had written for my application. And then after that, like I wasn't sure if I could like match
mm,
like the level, like stylistically that story. And so I think that like my first few stories that I wrote weren't very good. And there was one particular story that in Elizabeth McCracken's workshop that was torn apart, and rightly so, because it wasn't a very good story. And story wise, it was all right. But, and I think this is something that a lot of MFA students go through, especially their first few months. They want to impress their cohort and their mentors.
mm.
So sometimes they can go overboard in their writing, and then like this story was particularly overwritten. And I think that because I hadn't like lived in America for so long, and I had lived in a country where although English is the medium of instruction, like it's not really the lingua franca. So
Mhm.
I hadn't truly mastered the language yet. So
Mm.
on a sentence level it wasn't working. And yeah, that's why it didn't do very well at workshop. But because of that particular workshop, like I learned to scale down my prose a little. Like I thought that like I had to like impress people
By being
by
thorough,
using
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
by overwriting and like writing like similes that apparently didn't make any sense. So like I didn't have the necessary discipline yet to be adventurous in my language with while still making sense.
Mm, I see.
So I scaled back like with my on my adventurousness in my prose. And what happened was that my prose became really dry and really plain. And Alan Gerganis came in to for like a few weeks to teach some classes. And so he read a portion of a novel that I've since scrapped, but he said that like you're holding back with your prose. So like I was overcompensating, and then he was like, just let loose. And I think that by that time, because my language had more like discipline,
Mm,
or maybe like as a writer, I was just better as a writer by this time. Like I could let loose with my writing while maintaining that discipline
right.
in thought. Like I because like it used to be that I would write sentences that I thought sounded good, but as it turns out didn't make any sense even to me.
Mm,
And it's like a delicate balance that you learn as a creative writing student. And I can relate to what a lot of people say when they talk about struggling, especially during the first few months
mm.
of an MFA program, because like for the longest time they were probably the best writer in their
Yeah.
undergrad class
Yeah.
or in their community, and then all they're in the company of other very good writers, and then they become self-conscious
So
and
it's
they
a defense
start
mechanism.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that that happened to me, especially with my sloppy story, that I wasn't sure what I was doing, and I was like really afraid of people criticizing me, which was why like I just
Mm,
became really scatterbrained
yeah.
in my writing. But I think that like it's part of, I think it's a necessary part of our growth as writers, like
Hmm.
to go through those struggles.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I answered your
No,
question.
it's perfect
Yeah.
because we're going to that place again that is finding finding the voice and feel for what you want to do, even though there are some barriers in front of you.
Yeah.
I remember, yeah, having those moments where I started as a writer in Spanish, but moving into English when I was very, very young, when I knew I wanted to be a writer when I was very, very small, it
Yes.
felt like translating musicality and sort of the freedom that I had in the original language. But
And
obviously,
Spanish is so musical.
yes, yeah, and to bring it into a completely new framework of English, I mean, for any language, especially, something like Tagalog and
Yeah.
any other languages, there is that huge chasm that you have to overcome to realize, like, putting yourself apart and then throwing yourself
Yes.
over the bridge or the river and then putting yourself back together again.
Yeah, I can completely relate to that. Although he was in the New Writers Project, I attended some workshops with Antonio Ruiz Camacho, and you might know him, but he also struggled with that, like take making that leap from Spanish to
Hmm.
English because if I'm correct, he immigrated to the US as an adult.
Oh, and
So
that's way more complicated of,
yeah,
yeah.
eventually though he really worked at it. During especially during our MFA, I saw it, and like he worked really hard on it, and then eventually he yeah published Barefoot Dogs, and it's a really good
Oh,
story collection.
that's incredible. And see, those are the kinds of things that inspire me beyond belief, like the work that he did and the work that you have done to bridge that gap. Because I imagine that you have continued, of course, your creative education. I saw that you pursued additional uh, training or workshop opportunities in New Zealand. Was that right?
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
yes, that's correct.
So, where did you feel like you had eureka moments the most? Or right at the end of your education, did you feel like things were clicking for you?
I think there were several moments of that. It first happened in Texas when I started writing stories that satisfied me. And by that, I mean the language in which I was writing made me feel good. Like I felt that this language of the story expressed like what I truly felt and what
Hmm.
I truly wanted to say, or sometimes even like went beyond my original intentions.
Hmm.
So there were like several stories in the debut collection that I put out this year that achieved that. If I can mention some
Sure.
titles,
Yeah.
there's Playing with Dolls and Stopover. Those were stories in which I felt that I was beginning to be at home in the language and in this thing that I had chosen to do, which was to write fiction.
Hmm.
And then later on in my PhD, I did what they call a research based PhD in New Zealand,
Mm.
in which you don't have classes or you don't have a comp exam. From the beginning of your PhD, you write your dissertation. And so 70% of my dissertation was a creative project. And
Mm.
I chosen this program because there was no coursework. So I felt that, oh, I'll have so much time to do my novel
Hmm.
and to write my novel. And so during that time, I wrote a novella, which was loosely based on my own experiences as an immigrant in New Zealand.
Mhm.
But I felt really happy about the way I wrote that story. It wasn't part of my dissertation at all, but it ended up being part of the story collection that I published this year. And I think that even after the PhD, there were like several eureka moments. So I finished a draft of my novel in my PhD program, but it was a manuscript that, well, although my panel loved it,
Mm.
agents did not love it, especially my, the agent I had at the time who initially took me on for my story collection, which she was unable to sell as well. So I realized that like, oh, like I have a PhD already and all, and there are people who love this manuscript, but still I can take this manuscript further and there can be a deepening. And it's like a novel's the novel's a different ball game.
Mhm.
So I like it because you have a larger canvas for
Mhm.
developing characters, but at the same time, like because you have such a large canvas, you can make a mess. And
It goes off the rails easily, right?
yes.
Yeah.
So there was there was one particular character in my novel. Like my novel's about the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, and it's about three young people who come of age during the Marcos years. And of those three characters, there was one character who was very undeveloped, and I was telling his story through the perspectives of the two other characters because probably because I was too afraid to tell his story.
Mm.
And I think that was the main problem of the novel. So eventually, last year, I just took time off to work on that character, and I finished a draft of that novel at the I Park residency program in Connecticut last year.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, thank you. And so now I'm currently shopping it around, and yeah, there have been some full requests. But anyway, what was I talking about?
No,
Eureka
that's
moment.
wonderful
So
because
yeah.
it ties in. I think that we now find you at this wonderful place where the work is speaking to you. You're not denying where the work has to go. And so
Yes.
that also leads me to ask you about Love and Other Rituals, which is your story collection, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes.
So at that point, when did you feel like you had a good bulk of stories for a collection, or was it just one of those things where you said, I'm going to do a short story collection, and then you worked on all those? How did that one come about?
What happened was that I wrote a collection of stories for my MFA thesis. This
Mhm.
was just a collection of stories I had worked on for workshops during the MFA, and stories which I was like often, well, I wasn't forced to write them, but like because due to the pressure of deadlines, I had to come up with an idea for a story, and then
Yeah.
like slowly the collection started coming together. So there's one story that was part of my MFA application, and the bulk of the collection was written when I was an MFA student. And I think that, as with a lot of story collections, they're not like the ways in which these books come together isn't intentional,
Mm.
but because there are themes that we as writers are either obsessed with or just interested in, and these are themes that we work on from one story to another. Like they're like common themes and
Yeah.
common threads that emerge.
Hmm.
So um I the first story in the collection, or the earliest story that was written in set in Delaware, and it was me reflecting on my memories of childhood in Delaware. Although it's not really about children, it's about two people who fall in love
Hmm.
in Delaware, and two like Filipino immigrants. And
Oh, that's
I was
wonderful.
also a college, yeah, I was also a college student, and then I was going through these same experiences and feelings. But
Right.
then it was me probably returning to like what I perceived to be a second home for me,
Mm-hmm.
or like a second spiritual home, which was Delaware. And I was like returning to that place creatively. So it was probably my way of, um, if it makes any sense,
Yeah. Yeah.
like enacting or like enacting my own like nostalgia, or like turning my nostalgia into something tangible.
Right.
And then um when I was doing my MFA, like I had to like rack my brains for ideas for stories, and what emerged was my own like longing for my home, my other home, which was the Philippines.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also like my reflections on, or my, like these stories were a means for me to reflect on my emerging like self awareness
Mm-hmm.
as a Filipino.
Yeah.
Because when I was like living in the Philippines, it wasn't like I didn't really, it wasn't that I didn't see myself as a Filipino, but it wasn't something that I was like very conscious of.
Mm.
I was like I was just like living in a certain place. Like I didn't really care where it was. Or I did, but
Like you needed a bit of space to understand what had happened.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. So I needed space, or I needed some distance away from my homeland to realize how much of a Filipino I actually am,
Yeah.
and to see it as an actual place,
Right.
and like to actually miss it. So the stories I wrote were my means of like processing that nostalgia and that homesickness. Although there was like one story in the collection that I wrote as an MFA student that was set in Austin, Texas, and was my way of processing this like my falling out with a longtime friend
Mm.
who was a friend during my undergrad years in the Philippines, and then immigrated to the States a few years before I came to the States for my MFA. And she visited me in Austin, and then like what happened next was a huge falling out.
Mm.
So that story Stopover, and well, Stopover isn't like a direct reflection of what happened, but it was like very it's a very very loose,
Loose
it's
adaptation of
very very
events.
loosely, yeah, it's a very very loosely it's very very loosely based on real events. So
Right. Right.
very very fictionalized.
Yeah. So looking back on what home was versus what home is now to you, do you feel like the Philippines will always be home? Do you feel like you have quieted that feeling that maybe you belonged somewhere else?
Yeah, I don't,
Or if that was ever the case?
do I belong somewhere else? Like I think that there, in some ways, like I feel like I'm myself more when I'm not in the Philippines.
Mm.
And I think this is an experience that a lot of people have when they move to different countries as adults, that they can do certain things that they couldn't do in their home countries.
Oh, I
Like
can
I
imagine,
learned,
yeah.
yeah, like I learned to tango in New Zealand. And then I wrote about, like I sort of wrote about that in Leaving Auckland. Although I come to think of it now, I wrote Leaving Auckland before I started learning to tango, and I had to do a lot of research for the tango scenes in Leaving Auckland, and like
Mm.
the research led me to like actually taking tango classes. And then when I afterwards, like after my PhD, like I spent a few months in the States, and I was like traveling around, and I was like going to tango milongas, or like formal dances,
Mm.
in almost every city I visited. And then I like I met a lot of people and like a lot of interesting and funny and strange people, but I felt that I was like doing like I was coming into my own in ways that I couldn't whenever I was in the Philippines because there are no tango milongas here. Like this is a boring place. Like it's a cultural wasteland. But no, I shouldn't say that. I shouldn't say that. Like like there's a lot of interesting things coming out of the Philippines. But
Yeah, yeah. No, that's
advice
wonderful.
say
That's wonderful to hear because yeah, you do capture something about just being comfortable in your own skin that you would be able to try anything or willing to try anything that you wanted to because you're not burdened by, am
yes.
I from here or not? And I think a lot of us are looking to get to that threshold of like, I just am, no matter where I am, right?
Yeah, and well, the thing about being in a foreign country is that you're not that afraid of embarrassing yourself
Mm.
because um, because like
You're like,
the
I'm not going to
people
be here
you
again.
yeah, but yeah, and then the other thing is that the people who knew you since you were a kid won't see you anyway. So
That's great. I have a couple more questions to be mindful of your time, but I'm curious of what are some things that you are experiencing right now in terms of the arts or books or music or TV shows, whatever it may be, that is inspiring you or making you feel like you have revived energy to be creative?
hmm. Well, that's tough, especially because of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
Like I haven't been able to get out as much. So oh yeah, like I'm not sure if I should tell this story, but I went to a classical concert here in the Philippines, and then there were like there were these kittens that they were unable to remove, and I think they like these kittens were like they're stray kittens, like they were
Mm.
underneath the stage, so it was funny. So like there, so maybe that like I had just, but then it was like the first concert I had been to since the start of the pandemic. It was like it was with the UP University of the Philippines
Mm.
Symphony Orchestra,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, there were cats that were like yeah.
That's the most adorable thing I've heard. I really, really appreciate that because it's a very organic, very human moment that only a writer would appreciate. I'm sure that a lot of people were
Yeah.
like, "Hey, we want to listen to the music. What's going on here?" But only somebody like you,
Yeah,
like a writer,
it was
would.
funny because
Yeah.
like the cats were obviously I'm not sure like if they were consciously doing it, but I feel that they wanted to be part of the concert too. So there was a horn section and then in between the horns like so it would be duh, 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 and then meow and then so it was like
Oh
I
my
was like
god.
sorry, I'm just searching for things that I haven't been watching TV at all
Mm.
actually. Like, I've been really busy just reading and writing because I don't know, like especially during the pandemic and like es- in 2020 I was supposed to go to 3 residency programs, so I'd set
Mm.
aside time for that. Like I saved up money so that I
Yeah.
wouldn't have to work. And then like that didn't happen, so I got stuck at home.
Oh no.
And like because my dad died, like I've been
Mm-hmm.
uh living with my mom, so just to keep her company because I'm an
Sure.
only child.
Sure.
So anyway, like because of that I was like, oh, like I might either die here or like the pandemic will end before I know it and then I won't have any time to write again. So I like started just like really working really hard writing and reading, and so like that hasn't
Mm.
really stopped. But then so like oh yeah, like there's oh yeah, like a movie.
Yeah.
So this popped into my head. Like of the few movies I've seen during the pandemic, Drive My Car,
Mm.
like one of those movies that like has really stuck with me,
Yeah.
especially because like I'm a fan of Chekhov and I
Yes.
read Uncle Vanya in my early 20s and I loved how the movie like brought out these themes in Uncle Vanya that I think a lot of people would have overlooked.
Mm,
Like this
yeah.
notion of like just having to live with things that you may not necessarily like, or like certain heartbreaks that you didn't really bring upon yourself. Like these are things you just have to live with
Mm,
and accept. And it's a theme that has resonated with me, especially during this pandemic, because like there are a lot of like horrible things that happen to all of us that we've just had to live with.
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
like, how do you find meaning from that? Like somehow there's meaning in it, but like you just have to confront the discomforts you have with these like horrible things. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
well, you have to like live with your grief.
Right. Right. Do you
Yeah.
feel do you feel like being with family during the pandemic, and of course, you had this massive event happen in your life of losing a loved one. Um
Yeah.
and this is, I apologize if it may be a crass question, but
All right.
do you think that your creativity, your outlet has served you during this difficult time of high stress and of course with the loss of a loved one?
Definitely. Definitely. So I said that my dad died recently, but yeah, he died in 2017, but still it feels really recent to
Yeah.
me, especially because we were close
Mm-hmm.
and he was my first writing mentor and he like truly, truly believed in my work.
Mm-hmm.
So that loss was devastating. And I, I was in the middle of, or a few months before finishing my PhD when it happened. Like it was very
Mm,
sudden. So I felt that if I stopped writing then, if I allowed myself to be overwhelmed with my grief,
mm-hmm.
then I wouldn't write for years afterwards. And it's something that my dad wouldn't want for me. So
Mm,
it was horrible, but I kept writing. And then I wrote like I wrote an essay that wasn't very good about his wake and funeral. And I continued working on my novel. And it was probably the most horrible thing to go through. But it's not that like my grief became light because of my writing, but
mm-hmm.
it became something that I could live with
Mm.
and turn into something that would be, how do I say it, a fruitful part of my identity. Yeah, that doesn't make sense, but like,
No, I think it does.
yeah,
Yeah, because you can't remove that grief from you, right? I think that
no, no,
having that outlet, or at least that avenue for it to be put into, which is, I guess, the creative part of it, or at least just expressing and not holding it in, yeah,
yes,
would allow you to do that. But it's a powerful thing, and again, I'm very sorry for your loss. I know that a writer recognizes the potential of a writer, especially
yeah.
their child, and so I'm sure that there's just pure joy from that relationship and the memories that you have.
Oh, thank you, thank you. Yeah, that's like precisely my experience with him because, yeah, I think that it would have been harder for me to come into my own as a writer if I didn't have a parent who encouraged me and also provided me with that space
Mm-hmm.
to just be as a
Yeah,
writer. Like it's
yeah.
something that a lot of my friends don't have, and it's something that they struggle with, that like their parents just don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
my dad did, and also my mom, but look, especially my dad.
Right.
But yeah, and I think that like grief became a part of my work in ways that I didn't know it would. So during the pandemic and even before the pandemic, I wrote essays, and I think for a time I felt that the only way I could keep writing was to confront my grief directly
Hmm.
in essay form. Like with fiction, I don't know, like you're writing about other people, and sometimes you're writing about yourself, but through other people. But to confront your what's going on within you directly, nonfiction might be the better form.
Hmm.
So
I'm
yeah,
glad you mentioned that, because I did notice that you had a regular output of nonfiction essays and things like that. But there is a different mindset, right, that you take on when you're doing
yes.
nonfiction. And so is it one of those like, I'm going to remove my fiction cap and I'm going to look at the real world like a realist now and write an essay? Is that kind of how it works?
Well, in my case, I just felt that the only way for myself to keep writing was just to talk about my grief.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Yeah, and like I couldn't write about anything else, especially yeah, or I was like sometimes I was writing about events in my life, but still confronting my grief
Mm-hmm.
by looking at those events.
Right. Right.
So yeah, I couldn't for a time I couldn't write fiction, so I could only write nonfiction. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
So just one more question here. For people who are just starting out in their creative journey and they're doing writing, are there a handful of things that you could pass on to somebody who is at the very start of that creative journey, especially an immigrant child, an immigrant person, or
Yes.
somebody of color who's in this country in the United States or maybe anywhere in the
Mm-hmm.
world that
Yeah.
is looking to find confidence in their voice? What would you say to that person?
Well, writing for me, especially when I was living abroad as an immigrant, was my means of putting value in myself and recognizing myself and the stories I had and and my community had as stories worth telling. And sometimes like when you're an immigrant or even when you're a Filipino living in the Philippines and watching Hollywood movies with white characters and white actors, you feel that your story isn't worth telling when it is worth telling. And when you recognize that, you realize that you're also recognizing your own worth by allowing your stories to be told. And I'm not sure if that's great advice, but
No, I think
that's my
that's
experience.
perfect. Yeah. And I think it's a wonderful note to end on too. So I want to thank you, Monica, for your time and for your ability to find the good and find the beautiful things that we have out in the world that are waiting to be seen and putting them down on paper. And of course, for this wonderful conversation. So I'll be sure to put in a link to Love and Other Rituals in our episode
Thank
description.
you.
Yes, so folks can check it out. I know I'm excited to check that out myself too. But hopefully, when your next one comes around, feel free to let me know so we can chat again. Because,
Oh, thank you.
yeah,
Thank you.
with any writer, it feels like we just scratch the surface in a little bit of time.
I
But
know. I know. This was like I enjoyed this conversation and thank you for having me. It was very generous of you to invite me on your show.
it was my pleasure. But in the meantime, I will be in touch on the internet sometime soon with an episode.
Thank
But
you. Thank
yeah,
you.
thanks so much again, Monica. And I hope you take care
All
and you
right.
have a wonderful evening, because it's way late up over there.
And you have a wonderful day, Jaime. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.